The night my father called me replaceable in front of 30 employees, something inside me went completely quiet. Not angry, not shocked, just quiet. And honestly, that silence scared me more than if I had screamed. Because deep down, I think I finally understood something I had spent almost my entire life refusing to admit. No matter how much I sacrificed for my family's business, I was never being raised to inherit it. I was being trained to hold it together for someone else. The worst part? Everyone in that room heard him say it. The investors, the managers, the catering staff carrying champagne trays past us pretending not to listen. Even my younger brother looked embarrassed for about 3 seconds. Then he smiled. That fake, polished smile he always used whenever someone else was being humiliated instead of him. It happened during the company's 25th anniversary gala. A huge event. Expensive, over-designed, the kind of night built more for social media photos than actual gratitude. My father loved events like that. He liked standing under warm lights talking about family legacy, while employees who had not slept properly in weeks applauded him for being visionary. I know that sounds bitter. Maybe it is. But I also think some people become addicted to admiration long before they learn how to love it properly. Our company manufactured custom interior materials for hotels and commercial properties. Nothing glamorous. At least not originally. My grandfather started it with 12 workers in a rented warehouse and a second-hand delivery truck that barely survived the highway. Back then, according to everyone who knew him, the business was about craftsmanship. By the time my father took over, it became about image, presentation, expansion, networking, appearances, and my younger brother Daniel fit perfectly into that version of success. He was charismatic in a way people notice immediately. Loud, confident, stylish, the kind of person who could walk into a room and somehow make confidence look like competence. I was the opposite. I liked systems, schedules, budgets, stability. While Daniel posted inspirational quotes from airport lounges, pretending every business trip was a Forbes documentary, I was usually the one inside the warehouse at 6 a.m. solving supply chain disasters before clients noticed delays. For years, I told myself that was okay. Not everyone needs attention. Some people just want respect. At least that's what I used to believe. I'm Olivia Mercer, 32 years old, operations director of a company I practically helped save 3 times. But somehow, still treated like temporary staff in my own family. And if I sound calmer now than someone telling this story should sound, it's because the anger already burned itself out. What came after was colder, cleaner, more honest. The gala was being held at a luxury hotel outside Atlanta. Glass walls, live jazz, custom floral installations, a giant illuminated timeline of the company displayed across the ballroom, like we were unveiling a tech empire instead of selling architectural materials. Team Chintoy had spent almost 4 months preparing for that night. And yes, I say Team Chintoy intentionally. Because unlike my father and brother, the people actually running the company knew success was never one man giving speeches on a stage. It was exhausted employees fixing impossible problems quietly so clients never saw the cracks. By 7:30, the ballroom was full. Investors, suppliers, regional partners, local business media. My father was glowing. Daniel, too. He had spent the entire evening floating between conversations with a whiskey glass in one hand and meaningless leadership buzzwords in the other. Scaling vision, brand elevation, legacy positioning. I remember standing near the back of the ballroom watching him talk and thinking, confidence really is dangerous when nobody forces it to earn itself. Then my father called me toward the stage. At first, I honestly thought he was about to thank me, which now feels embarrassing to admit. But when you spend your life surviving on scraps of approval, even basic acknowledgement starts feeling important. I walked up beside him while photographers adjusted their cameras. He wrapped an arm around Daniel first, then glanced at me. People always ask me which one of my children will eventually lead Mercer Interiors into the future. The room laughed politely. My father smiled. And the answer is obvious. Daniel grinned before the sentence even finished. That should have told me everything. Then my father raised his glass slightly and said, every successful company needs a face people trust. He squeezed Daniel's shoulder, and someone behind the scenes willing to do the work nobody notices. Then he looked directly at me. Thankfully, Olivia understands not everyone is meant to lead. Some people are simply replaceable if the system is good enough. The room went silent. Not fully silent. There was still music, still glasses clinking somewhere far away. But emotionally, silent. You know what hurt most? Not the sentence, the reaction after it. A few people laughed awkwardly because they thought they were supposed to. One investor looked down at his drink immediately. A woman from accounting actually winced. And Daniel smirked. Not huge, just enough. Just long enough. That tiny expression people make when something cruel benefits them. My father kept talking after that. Making jokes, giving speeches, thanking people. But I stopped hearing him. Because suddenly every memory I had spent years minimizing started connecting itself into one ugly pattern. Every weekend I worked while Daniel traveled. Every crisis I cleaned up quietly. Every client relationship I repaired after his mistakes. Every time my father called me steady while calling him exceptional. I used to think those words meant different strengths. That night I realized one was admiration. The other was utility. And utility has an expiration date. I smiled through the rest of the event. That part surprises people when they hear this story. But I think many responsible children learn early that humiliation is easier to survive when your face stays calm. So I shook hands, thanked guests, solved seating issues, handled a vendor payment problem myself when finance failed to transfer it on time. Because of course, they did. The funny thing about functional people is that everyone assumes they will continue functioning no matter how badly they are treated. Around 10:15, I stepped outside near the hotel gardens to breathe. The air smelled like rain and expensive perfume drifting out from the ballroom doors. My phone buzzed. A message from Mia, my best friend, former coworker. One of the only people who ever said out loud what everyone else in the company whispered privately. You okay? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. No. Then another message appeared immediately. I'm outside. I found her sitting near the valet entrance with 2 paper coffee cups even though it was nearly nighttime. That was very Mia. Always bringing comfort like she expected disaster before other people noticed it. She handed me 1 cup, looked at my face once and said quietly, he finally did it in public. Not. What happened? Not, are you upset? Just truth. Clean and immediate. I laughed once after she said it. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes your body laughs when the alternative is falling apart in a parking lot wearing heels you regret buying. I think part of me always knew, I told her. She nodded slowly. Toing Eve too. We sat there for a while, listening to traffic beyond the hotel entrance. Then Mia asked the question that changed everything. If you disappeared from that company for 1 month, what do you think would happen? I answered too fast. It would collapse. And the second I said it, something shifted inside me. Because for the first time in years, I stopped hearing that truth as pride, and started hearing it as a warning. I think Chinchoi romanticize loyalty too much sometimes, especially in families. We praise the person who sacrifices endlessly, who fixes everything, carries everyone, absorbs stress quietly. But nobody asks why one person always has to bleed to keep everyone else comfortable. That night, sitting outside a hotel while my family celebrated a legacy I had practically built with my own exhaustion, I realized something painful. If your love is only welcomed when it comes with labor, that is not love. That is dependency, wearing the costume of family. Around midnight, I finally went back inside. The gala was ending. Guests were leaving with gift boxes and branded champagne flutes. My father was already discussing expansion plans with investors. Daniel was taking photos near the company backdrop like a politician after winning an election. Neither of them noticed me immediately. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel invisible. I felt free from needing to be seen by people who had already decided my value years ago. Then Daniel walked over smiling, half drunk. Perfect tie loosened just enough to look intentional. He clapped my shoulder lightly. You know, Dad didn't mean anything personal, right? There it was. The sentence people use when they want access to your forgiveness without facing what they actually did. I looked at him carefully, really carefully. And suddenly, I noticed something I had ignored for years. Daniel was not cruel because he was stronger than me. He was cruel because everyone around him had spent his whole life protecting him from consequences. That creates a very dangerous kind of weakness. I asked him one question. Do you even know how much of this company's operations I handle? He laughed immediately. See, this is why Dad says you take things too seriously. Not an answer. Because people who benefit from imbalance rarely examine it closely. I nodded once. Then I said quietly, I think both of you are about to learn something very expensive. His smile faded slightly. Not fear yet, just confusion. Good. At that point, confusion was enough. Because for the first time in my life, I was no longer thinking like the daughter desperate to keep the peace. I was starting to think like someone preparing to leave. I did not quit the company the next morning. That would have been dramatic, emotional, temporary, and contrary to what my father believed about me, I was never emotional when making important decisions. I was careful. That difference matters. People often confuse quiet people with weak people because they mistake silence for surrender. But silence is sometimes just calculation happening privately. The Monday after the gala, I arrived at the office before sunrise like I always did. Same parking garage. Same security guard half asleep behind the lobby desk. Same smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room on the 4th floor. Nothing looked different. Which almost made the humiliation feel unreal. Like maybe I had exaggerated it in my head. Then I walked past the framed gala photographs already being prepared for the hallway display. And there it was. My father smiling proudly beside Daniel, me standing slightly behind them, half cropped by the photographer's angle. That hurt more than I expected. Not because of the picture itself, because it perfectly summarized my entire life. Present, necessary, but never centered. I went into my office, closed the door, and opened the quarterly operations reports. If I was going to leave, I needed to know exactly what would happen after I did. Not emotionally, operationally. There's a difference. And honestly, Toingi Nyungui underestimate how dangerous competent people become once they stop prioritizing loyalty over clarity. By noon, I already had a list. Vendor relationships handled exclusively through me. Client renewals tied to my direct communication. Shipping contingencies nobody else fully understood. 3 unresolved compliance issues Daniel did not even know existed. And payroll. God. Payroll alone could destroy them within 2 weeks if mishandled. I stared at the numbers, feeling something strange growing inside me. Not revenge. Exhaustion. The kind that comes when you finally realize you have been carrying an entire structure held together by guilt. Around 2 in the afternoon, my father called an executive meeting. Daniel walked in 20 minutes late wearing sunglasses indoors like he had spent the morning filming a podcast instead of preparing for investor expansion. Nobody said anything. Of course they didn't. That was the family dynamic in one image. Daniel created messes. Other people adjusted around them. My father started discussing the company's next era, new markets, brand elevation, potential expansion into luxury commercial design partnerships. He kept saying, vision. I kept thinking, you cannot scale dysfunction forever. Then he dropped the real announcement. He wanted Daniel to begin transitioning into a larger leadership role immediately. A few people exchanged quick glances around the conference table. Subtle, fast, but noticeable if you spent years learning how people hide concern professionally. Then my father smiled at me. Olivia will help with the transition process, obviously. Nobody understands the operational side better. There it was again. Not leadership, support. Always support. Always the engine. Never the driver. Daniel leaned back in his chair grinning. We make a good team. No, we didn't. A team requires mutual respect. This was dependency disguised as hierarchy. I looked around the table slowly. Most people avoided eye contact, not because they agreed with my father, because workplaces built around family power teach employees survival before honesty. That's something Team Chunto used to discuss quietly after difficult meetings. How companies become emotionally dangerous when truth starts threatening someone's ego. I remember one manager telling me years ago, your father doesn't reward competence, he rewards admiration. At the time, I defended him. Now I wish I hadn't. Because protecting painful truths early often creates worse pain later. After the meeting ended, Daniel followed me into my office carrying his usual careless confidence like expensive cologne. You've been weird since the gala. I almost laughed. weird. That's what people call boundaries when they benefited from your lack of them. He sat across from my desk, spinning one of my pens between his fingers. You know Dad's under pressure, right? There it was again. Excuses wrapped as explanations. My entire childhood sounded exactly like that. Your brother is sensitive. Your father is stressed. Don't take things personally. You're stronger than this. Eventually you realize something horrifying. Some families assign emotional roles so early that nobody notices how unfair they are anymore. One child becomes the center of protection. The other becomes emotionally recyclable. I asked him calmly, "Do you know how many weekends I worked last year?" He frowned immediately. What does that have to do with anything? Exactly. That answer told me everything. People who are consistently rescued from consequences rarely measure sacrifice accurately, because sacrifice invisible to them feels imaginary. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and rotated the screen toward him. Late-night crisis logs, vendor interventions, emergency client recoveries, production delays fixed quietly before executives heard about them. Nearly every major operational save in the last 3 years had my name attached somewhere behind it. Daniel stared for a second, then shrugged. Well, that's your job. That sentence, that single sentence. I think it permanently changed how I saw my family. Because suddenly I understood the real issue was not lack of gratitude, it was entitlement. They genuinely believed my labor belonged to them. Not because they were monsters, because I had trained them to believe it by surviving silently for too long. And that realization hurt. People talk a lot about toxic families, but I think the more dangerous situations are the ones built slowly through normalization. No screaming, no obvious abuse. Just years of one person giving more and more while everyone slowly starts treating it as baseline expectation, like oxygen. Important only once missing. Daniel stood up eventually. You're overthinking everything. Maybe. Or maybe overthinking is what underappreciated people call survival. After he left, I sat alone in my office for almost an hour without moving. Then my email notification appeared. Subject line, urgent. Hartwell Resort contract issue. I closed my eyes immediately. Of course. Hartwell Resort was one of our largest commercial clients, luxury lakeside property development. Massive account. Extremely demanding. And Daniel had been handling the relationship publicly for months because my father wanted him visible in front of premium clients. But behind the scenes, I was still fixing nearly everything quietly. I opened the thread. 3 shipping deadlines had been miscommunicated. Material specifications were incorrect, and the resort's executive team was threatening penalties if delays continued. I checked the attached correspondence. Daniel had ignored 2 warning emails last week, because of course he had. My phone rang 30 seconds later. My father. I answered. Not because I wanted to, because responsibility becomes muscle memory after enough years. Olivia, he snapped immediately. Why am I hearing about Hartwell from the client before hearing it from our own people? Our own people. Interesting phrasing considering Daniel was supposedly future leadership. I kept my voice calm, because Daniel missed the compliance revisions. Silence. Then, well, fix it. No accountability, no discussion, no consequences. Just, Olivia will handle it. Like always. Something cold settled inside my chest then. Not rage. Recognition. I think that was the week I finally accepted a truth I had avoided most of my adult life. The company did not value me because I was family. The company survived because I compensated for family. That is a very different thing. That night, I stayed at the office until nearly 11 fixing the Hartwell disaster myself. Again, the cleaning crew passed my office twice. At one point, Martha from accounting stopped by quietly holding her purse. She hesitated before speaking. You know people notice, right? I looked up. Notice what? Her expression softened in a way that almost hurt worse than cruelty. How much you carry for them? I didn't answer immediately, because honestly, I wasn't sure whether being seen made me feel comforted or ashamed anymore. Martha leaned against the doorway carefully. I worked for your grandfather before your father took over. That surprised me. He used to say something, she continued quietly. He said the most dangerous employee in any company is the one who finally realizes they were loyal to people who only valued their usefulness. The room went completely still after she said that. I think part of me already knew where the story was heading, but hearing it out loud made it real. Martha gave me a sad smile before leaving, and for the first time in years, I opened my laptop, not to save the company, but to calculate how long it would survive without me. For the next 2 weeks, I said almost nothing. That was intentional. People expect conflict before they notice departure, and I had no interest in giving my family time to emotionally corner me back into compliance. So instead, I watched, carefully. The company looked successful from the outside. That's important to understand. We still had polished branding, strong clients, industry connections, a beautiful headquarters lobby my father loved showing visitors, like it proved stability. But underneath, everything was stretched too thin. Processes depended on verbal memory instead of systems. Client retention depended on personal trust instead of structure. Entire departments relied on a handful of exhausted employees quietly compensating for leadership chaos. And most dangerous of all, nobody at the top seemed aware of how fragile everything actually was. That's the thing about people protected from consequences for too long. They mistake survival for strategy. Daniel especially. After the gala, he became even more performative. More meetings, more public appearances, more speeches about innovation. At one point, he filmed a motivational video inside the warehouse while workers behind him were dealing with delayed inventory shipments he forgot to approve. I remember watching him through the glass office wall thinking, some people become addicted to looking successful long before they learn how to build success properly. Meanwhile, Toy kept doing what I always did, fixing things. But differently now. Before I solved problems invisibly, now I documented them. Every missed approval, every ignored warning, every client issue rerouted quietly through me. Every financial shortcut my father insisted was temporary. Not because I planned revenge, because clarity matters when manipulation starts rewriting history. And families like mine rewrite history constantly. The favorite child becomes promising. The responsible child becomes cold. The exhausted child becomes difficult. The one who finally stops sacrificing becomes selfish. I had lived inside that language my whole life. I was finally learning to translate it accurately. One Thursday morning, Mia walked into my office holding 2 copies again. She took one look at my desk covered in spreadsheets and sighed. "You're building an exit plan." Not a question. I nodded. She sat down slowly. "You know they're going to lose their minds when they realize you're serious." I leaned back in my chair. "No," I said quietly. "They're going to lose their minds when they realize how much of the company was actually running through me." That silence afterward said more than agreement could have. Because Mia knew. Honestly, most senior employees knew. Nobody said it openly, because family businesses operate on emotional politics as much as business logic. Truth becomes dangerous when it threatens hierarchy. Mia stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you stay this long?" That question hit harder than I expected, because the answer sounded pathetic once spoken out loud. I thought loyalty would eventually become love. I laughed softly after saying it. Not because it was funny, because some truths arrive so late they almost embarrass you. Mia looked genuinely sad then, and that hurt in a different way. Pity from strangers wounds less than understanding from people who watched you destroy yourself slowly. "I think Chungtoy teach responsible people the wrong lessons growing up," she said quietly. "How so?" "We praise them for enduring things they should have never been asked to endure." God, that sentence stayed with me. Even now. Especially now. The following week, my father announced a major investor dinner at his house. Small gathering. Private. Important. And apparently Daniel would be presenting the company's 5-year expansion strategy, which would have been impressive if I hadn't written almost the entire operational framework myself 6 months earlier. No credit, obviously. Just another invisible transfer of labor inside a family system built on selective acknowledgement. I almost skipped the dinner, but something told me not to. Maybe instinct. Maybe exhaustion finally turning into clarity. Either way, I went. My parents' house sat in one of those wealthy suburban neighborhoods designed to look warm while quietly competing with every nearby property. Perfect landscaping. Stone entrance. Oversized windows glowing amber at sunset. Everything curated. My mother opened the door smiling too brightly. That instantly told me tension already existed somewhere underneath the evening. Families obsessed with appearances become emotionally theatrical under pressure. Olivia, she said, kissing my cheek quickly, try to relax tonight, okay? Your father's stressed. There it was again, the lifelong assignment. Manage everyone else's emotions before your own. I think many overlooked children understand that role intimately. You become emotional staff inside your own family. Inside, investors were already drinking wine near the dining room, while Daniel performed confidence beside a giant digital presentation screen. He looked expensive. That sounds cruel. But there's a difference between looking accomplished and being accomplished. And I had spent years cleaning up the gap between those two things. Dinner started smoothly enough. Business talk, expansion projections, market growth. Then one investor asked a simple question, a very normal question. How prepared is the company operationally for scaling at that pace? Daniel froze. Just slightly. Most people wouldn't notice it. I did. Because I had spent years recognizing the exact second confidence stops being enough. He started answering vaguely, talking about leadership culture, brand momentum, adaptability, corporate fog. The investor smiled politely but repeated the question more specifically. What systems are in place to absorb supply chain volatility during regional expansion? Silence. Daniel glanced at me instinctively, like muscle memory. Like somewhere deep down, even he understood who actually carried the answers. And before I could speak, my father interrupted. Olivia handles most of those back-end details. Back-end details. Interesting phrase for the infrastructure keeping your company alive. The investor turned toward me instead. I answered calmly. Specific logistics timelines, vendor diversification strategies, emergency manufacturing contingencies, compliance sequencing. Real answers, not performance. By the time I finished, the investor looked more impressed with me than anyone else in the room. And my father noticed. Immediately. You could actually feel the atmosphere shift. People like my father enjoy competence until it competes with the image they already decided should represent success. After dinner, while guests moved outside for drinks, my father cornered me alone near the kitchen. His voice stayed low, controlled, which somehow made it worse. You embarrassed your brother tonight. I stared at him honestly, thinking I misheard. He was asked a question. You made him look unprepared. No, reality made him look unprepared. But families built on favoritism often confuse truth with betrayal. I felt something inside me go very still again, that same dangerous stillness from the gala. I answered because nobody else could. Wrong answer. His expression hardened immediately. You always do this. Do what? Make people feel small. I actually laughed once, a tiny exhausted laugh I could not stop, because hearing that after years of shrinking myself to protect everyone else's ego felt almost unreal. Toy spent my entire life making myself smaller for this family. His face changed slightly after I said that. Not guilt, more like discomfort, because uncomfortable truths sound aggressive to people benefiting from them. Then he said the sentence that finally broke whatever loyalty I still had left. If your brother fails, this family fails. You should understand that by now. Not the company, not the employees, not both children, just Daniel. Everything protecting him, everything orbiting him, everything sacrificed for him, including me. And suddenly my entire childhood made sense in one horrifying instant. Why my mistakes were punished harder. Why my achievements were minimized. Why my exhaustion was expected. I was never being raised as an equal child. I was being conditioned into support structure. Useful, reliable, emotionally durable, replaceable. I looked at my father for a long moment after that. Really looked at him. And for the first time in my life, I stopped seeing him as a difficult parent. I saw him as a deeply insecure man who built an entire family system around protecting the child who reflected his ego most comfortably. That realization changed everything, because once you stop romanticizing people, you start seeing the cost of loving them clearly. I left the dinner early. No scene, no argument, just my coat, my keys, the sound of my mother calling after me from the hallway asking why I was being sensitive again. Sensitive. Interesting word. People often call you sensitive once your pain becomes inconvenient for them. I drove home through rain so heavy, the highway lights blurred gold against the windshield. And somewhere between mile marker 42 and downtown Atlanta, I made the decision. Not emotionally, not impulsively, calmly. I was leaving the company. The real question was no longer whether I deserved better. The real question was, how much would collapse cost to the people who spent years assuming I would stay, no matter how they treated me? I gave myself 30 days before resigning. Not because I was hesitating, because responsible people prepare exits carefully, especially when other people's livelihoods are attached to the fallout. That mattered to me. No matter how angry I was at my family, I refused to punish employees who had done nothing wrong. That distinction is important. Real maturity is understanding the difference between consequences and collateral damage. So for the next month, I did something my father never expected from me. I stopped protecting the company from reality. Not dramatically, quietly. I documented processes properly, transferred essential information to department leads, cleaned up operational gaps nobody else knew existed. But I also stopped doing one very specific thing. I stopped catching problems before leadership felt them. That changed everything faster than I expected. The first week alone, Daniel forgot to confirm a supplier extension for a hotel project in Nashville. Normally, I would have noticed 2 days early and fixed it before anyone panicked. This time, I let the notification sit in his inbox exactly where it belonged. By Thursday morning, procurement was scrambling. By Friday afternoon, my father was furious. And for the first time in years, the frustration landed on the person who actually caused the problem. Not me. The strange thing? I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity. I think Chumtoy sometimes confuse self-sacrifice with kindness because we were raised to believe preventing consequences is the same thing as loving people. It isn't. Sometimes rescuing people repeatedly is exactly what keeps them emotionally immature. Daniel especially started unraveling once systems stopped bending around him invisibly. Meetings ran longer, deadlines slipped, clients became impatient. Nothing catastrophic yet, just cracks. Real ones. The kind hidden for years by exhausted people working quietly in the background. One afternoon, Martha from accounting passed my office and whispered, "It's starting." I knew exactly what she meant. By week 2, my father's mood had become unpredictable. One moment charming in front of investors, the next snapping at employees over problems he barely understood. Because underneath all his confidence was a terrifying truth. He had spent years believing the company functioned because of leadership vision, not because a handful of overworked people compensated for chaos daily, and reality was beginning to embarrass him publicly. That was the only thing he truly feared. Embarrassment. Not failure. Not burnout. Not losing me. Image. People obsessed with image rarely change until consequences become visible to outsiders. That Friday, Daniel stormed into my office without knocking. "You're doing this on purpose." I looked up from my laptop calmly. Doing what? This attitude. Interesting. Not the operational failures, not his missed responsibilities, just my lack of emotional labor. He paced across the office aggressively. "You stopped helping." There it was, finally, the truth. Not, "You stopped loving us." Not, "You seem hurt." Not, "We treated you unfairly." Just, "You stopped making our lives easier." I closed my laptop slowly. "For years," I said quietly, "you thought my support was automatic because I never let you experience what happened without it." Daniel scoffed immediately. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said. "I'm being absent." That hit him harder. I could tell, because emotionally dependent people panic when the person stabilizing everything emotionally detaches calmly. Anger they understand. Stillness terrifies them. He stared at me for a long moment, then finally said what he really meant. "Dad's stressed out." I almost smiled. Even now. Even here. His instinct was still protecting upward instead of reflecting inward. That's what favoritism does sometimes. It doesn't only damage the neglected child, it emotionally cripples the protected one too. Daniel genuinely did not know how to exist inside accountability. No one had ever forced him to. "You know what's funny?" I asked softly. "What?" "You still think this conversation is about stress instead of respect." He rolled his eyes immediately. "There you go again, making everything emotional." That sentence almost broke my heart, because it explained my entire family perfectly. They benefited from my emotional endurance for so long that the moment I described reality honestly, they called it emotional instability. I stood up slowly. "You know what the saddest part is?" He crossed his arms. "What?" "I don't think any of you ever noticed how tired I was." Silence. Real silence this time. Not because he suddenly understood, because for one brief second, I think he realized there were parts of me he had never bothered learning. Then his phone buzzed. He checked it immediately. Crisis somewhere else. Another issue. Another delay. His expression tightened, and instinctively, he looked at me, waiting, expecting, hoping I would step in automatically like always. I didn't move. That moment lasted maybe 3 seconds, but honestly, it felt like years ending. Then he left without another word. That night, I finalized my resignation letter. Simple, professional, 30-day transition notice, no accusations, no emotional paragraphs, no family references, just facts. I printed it at home around midnight while rain tapped softly against my apartment windows, and unexpectedly, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly at my kitchen counter while the printer hummed beside me. Because grief is strange. Sometimes you don't cry when people hurt you. You cry when you finally accept they are not going to become who you needed. I think many adult children understand that feeling. Mourning people who are still alive. The next morning, I arrived early again. Same parking garage, same elevator, same hallway lined with corporate achievement photos. Only this time, I was carrying an ending inside my bag. My father was already in his office when I knocked. He barely looked up. Make it quick. I'm busy. I walked in calmly and placed the envelope on his desk. That got his attention. What's this? My resignation. The room went completely still. For a second, he genuinely looked confused. Not upset. Confused. Like the idea itself made no sense. Then he laughed once. Actually laughed. Very funny. I'm serious. His expression changed immediately. You can't leave right now. Interesting wording. Not, why are you leaving? Not, what happened? Not, can we talk? Just, you can't. Like I was infrastructure trying to quit being a building. He opened the letter to me. Read the first lines. Then looked at me sharply. This is because of that stupid dinner? That stupid dinner. Amazing how people downgrade moments once they are forced to face consequences from them. I kept my voice steady. No, this is because of years. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. No, I said softly. I think I underreacted for most of my life. That landed. I saw it. Tiny shift behind his eyes. Not empathy. Recognition. Dangerous recognition. Because suddenly he realized something he should have understood years earlier. I was no longer negotiating emotionally. I was done. He stood up abruptly. You're being selfish. There it was. The word every dysfunctional system eventually throws at the person who stops overfunctioning. I almost felt sad hearing it, because once you understand the pattern, the manipulation becomes predictable. Toy gave this company 12 years, I said quietly. You're part of this family. No, I answered. I was useful to this family. His face hardened instantly. That's ridiculous. Is it? He stepped closer now, voice lower, more dangerous. You think you're irreplaceable? And there it was again, replaceable. That word, always hanging underneath everything with him. I looked at my father calmly for a long moment. Then I said the sentence I had been carrying inside me since the gala. I think you built this company around the assumption that I would tolerate disrespect forever. For the first time in my life, he had no immediate response. Because truth becomes very difficult to control once the quiet person finally says it out loud. I turned toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. He didn't answer. I looked back at him. You spent years teaching Daniel that charisma mattered more than responsibility. Silence. And you spent years teaching me responsibility mattered more than dignity. His expression changed then, finally. Not anger, fear. Small, brief, but real. Because somewhere deep down, I think he realized the company was not losing an employee. It was losing the person who had been secretly carrying the weight of everyone else's illusions. The 30 days after my resignation felt strangely peaceful. Not easy. Peaceful. Peaceful? There's a difference. Easy means nothing hurts. Peace means the hurting finally stops confusing itself with love. My father did not speak to me for almost a week after I submitted my notice. Not directly, anyway. Instead, messages came through other people. Classic family politics. My mother called saying he was under a lot of pressure. Daniel texted, "You're blowing this way out of proportion." One senior manager awkwardly asked whether this was temporary emotional burnout. Interesting phrase. People become very creative when trying to avoid admitting someone has legitimate reasons to leave. Meanwhile, the company kept wobbling. Not collapsing yet, just exposing itself. And honestly, that was worse, because sudden disasters can be blamed on bad luck. Slow, visible unraveling forces people to confront patterns. Deadlines started slipping publicly now. Clients stopped receiving immediate answers. Internal confusion reached departments previously protected from it. One project manager quietly admitted to me in the hallway, "I didn't realize how many decisions were actually going through you." I smiled politely, but inside, something hurt. Because recognition arriving only after exhaustion is still a kind of tragedy. I spent years screaming competence silently. Nobody listened until silence itself became expensive. The strangest part? Employees began acting nervous around me. Not hostile. Careful. Like people standing near someone who finally stopped pretending everything was okay. That happens in dysfunctional environments. Once one person breaks the illusion, everyone else becomes aware of how fragile it always was. 2 weeks into my notice period, the Hartwell Resort account exploded completely. Not metaphorically, actually exploded. A shipment issue Daniel ignored triggered construction delays across multiple installation phases. The resort executives demanded an emergency meeting. Investors got copied into the email chain. Legal language appeared. That's when panic finally became visible at the executive level. My father called me into the boardroom that afternoon. Daniel was already there, pacing aggressively. 3 department heads sat silently along the wall, pretending not to witness family collapse disguised as corporate discussion. My father didn't waste time. Fix this. No greeting, no conversation, just expectation. I looked at the documents calmly. The issue was fixable, but not quickly, and definitely not invisibly anymore. That depends, I said quietly. My father frowned immediately. Depends on what? Whether Daniel is willing to explain to the client why he ignored multiple compliance warnings. Daniel stopped pacing. Seriously? I met his stare evenly. Yes, seriously. The room went tight, emotionally tight, because for years everyone watched me absorb blame quietly to protect leadership image. This was new, not cruelty, just accountability finally standing upright. Daniel scoffed. "You're trying to humiliate me." No, reality was humiliating him. I was just refusing to interrupt it anymore. "That's not what's happening here," I said calmly. My father slammed a folder onto the table hard enough to make one manager flinch. This company does not need internal division right now. And there it was. The language of dysfunctional systems. Truth becomes division. Boundaries become disrespect. Consequences become betrayal. I think Chumtoy normalized unhealthy loyalty far too much in families and workplaces, especially toward competent people. We expect the responsible one to absorb unfairness forever because their stability makes everyone else comfortable. But stability built on one person's silent suffering is not stability. It's dependency. And dependency always panics when access gets removed. My father stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. "You're embarrassing this family." That sentence would have destroyed me years earlier. Not anymore. Because once someone sees the pattern clearly, the emotional hook stops sinking as deep. "No," I answered softly. "I'm just no longer protecting it from itself." Silence. One of the department heads looked down immediately after I said that, because everyone in that room knew it was true. That's the uncomfortable thing about truth inside broken systems. Most people recognize it long before anyone says it aloud. Daniel suddenly laughed bitterly. "You really think you're the victim here?" Victim. Interesting word. I think people become defensive around boundaries because boundaries force them to measure how much they've benefited from your lack of them. I looked at my brother carefully, really carefully, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel envy toward him, just sadness, because favoritism had hollowed him out too. He had spent his whole life protected from discomfort so completely that basic accountability now felt like personal attack. That is not strength. That is emotional malnutrition, wearing confidence as camouflage. "I don't think I'm a victim," I said quietly. "I think I was useful." The room went still again. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because deep down, he knew. Maybe not fully, maybe not consciously, but somewhere inside him, he knew the company functioned differently around me. And somewhere deeper, he knew why. The meeting ended without resolution, mostly because there was no clean resolution left. Only consequences delayed too long. That night, I stayed late one final time helping transition operational systems to department teams. Not for my father. Not for Daniel. For the employees. People with mortgages. Children. Actual lives attached to executive irresponsibility. Before leaving, I walked through the warehouse floor alone. Forklifts parked silently. Half-packed material crates lined beneath industrial lights. The smell of sawdust and machine oil lingering in cold air. I had spent most of my adult life inside that building. Missing birthdays. Canceling vacations. Answering emails at 2 a.m. Fixing crises nobody ever knew existed. And suddenly, I realized something painful. I had given so much energy trying to earn respect from people who had already decided usefulness was enough. That realization changes a person permanently. I think many responsible children secretly believe if they work hard enough, someone will eventually notice their exhaustion and love them for it. But exhaustion is not proof of worth, and overfunctioning is not the same thing as being valued. When I finally left the building near midnight, Martha was waiting near the lobby holding her coat. She smiled sadly when she saw me. "You're really leaving?" I nodded. "Yes." She hesitated before speaking again. "You know something?" "What?" "Your grandfather would have hated what this place became." That hit harder than I expected. Because my grandfather had loved craftsmanship, people, integrity, steady work, not performance, not ego, not this constant obsession with appearance. Martha looked toward the darkened offices upstairs. "Your father built a company people admired." Then she looked back at me carefully. "You built one that actually worked." I almost cried right there. Not because it was praise, because it was probably the first honest acknowledgement I had received in years. I hugged her goodbye, then walked into the parking garage feeling strangely lighter. Not healed, but untangled. That weekend, Mia convinced me to spend 2 days at a small lake cabin outside the city. No laptops, no meetings, no family calls. The first morning there, I woke up before sunrise automatically. My body still trained for crisis. I sat outside wrapped in a blanket watching fog drift across the water while birds moved through pine trees quietly. And for the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. No emergency, no emotional labor, no impossible problem waiting in my inbox. Just silence. Real silence. Not the dangerous, numb silence from the gala. This one felt different. Gentler. Human. Mia stepped outside, eventually carrying coffee. She sat beside me without speaking for a while, then asked softly, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Tired," I admitted. She nodded. "Yeah." Then after a long pause, I finally said the thing I had been too ashamed to admit before. "I don't think they ever really knew me." That sentence hurt, because I think part of becoming an adult is realizing some people only love the version of you that made their life easier, not the real you underneath survival. Mia looked out across the lake quietly. Then she said, "I think they knew you were good. They just got too comfortable benefiting from it." God. That sentence stayed with me for weeks, because it felt true. Not evil, not dramatic, just true. And honestly, truth is usually much quieter than revenge fantasies. The real heartbreak wasn't that my family hated me. It was worse. They loved me in a way that still allowed them to use me. And sometimes that kind of love damages people most of all. The following Monday was my final day at Mercer Interiors. By noon, 3 different department managers had privately asked if I was sure about leaving. One even hinted he might resign too eventually. Not because of me specifically. Because once one person stops normalizing dysfunction, everyone else starts seeing it more clearly too. Around 4 in the afternoon, I packed the last box from my office. A plant, some notebooks, a framed photo of me and Mia from years ago before burnout started hollowing out my face. No family pictures. I noticed that accidentally. Or maybe not accidentally. Then, just as I was taping the final box shut, the fire alarm started screaming through the building. The fire alarm turned out to be a false emergency. Burned wiring in a storage panel downstairs. But for about 7 minutes, the entire building descended into chaos. Employees rushed through hallways carrying laptops. Managers shouted conflicting instructions. Someone triggered the wrong evacuation protocol and accidentally locked 2 loading exits. And standing in the middle of all of it was Daniel. Frozen. Not completely useless. Not stupid. Just overwhelmed. Because confidence built for presentation collapses differently under real pressure. I watched from the end of the hallway holding my office box against my hip, while employees instinctively started turning toward me for direction. That hurt more than it should have, because muscle memory is powerful. Even after everything, people still expected me to stabilize the room. One warehouse coordinator looked directly at me and asked, "What do we do?" For one dangerous second, I almost stepped back into my old role automatically. Fix it, carry it, protect everyone from discomfort. That instinct does not disappear overnight, especially when your entire identity was built around usefulness. But then I saw Daniel. Saw my father yelling at the facilities manager instead of solving anything. Saw employees panicking because leadership had spent years performing authority instead of building competence. And suddenly, something inside me settled calmly. No anger, no revenge, just truth. This was never mine to carry alone, so I gave clear instructions only where necessary for safety. Nothing more. Evacuate the west corridor, use the secondary loading exit, wait outside for clearance. Professional, measured, human. Then I walked out of the building with everyone else. The cold air outside hit my face sharply. Employees clustered together in the parking lot, whispering anxiously while emergency crews checked the electrical issue. And, standing there under flashing red lights, I realized something almost frightening. The company already looked different without me emotionally attached to it. Not because I was irreplaceable. No human being is. But because systems built around silent overfunctioning eventually expose themselves once the overfunctioning stops. That's an important lesson. I think society praises self-sacrificing people too aggressively without asking why the sacrifice became necessary in the first place. Healthy systems do not require one exhausted person constantly bleeding competence to survive. My father approached me outside about 20 minutes later. Tie loosened, face tense, pride cracking visibly around the edges. "Can we talk?" That alone shocked me. Not because he asked, because of how tired he sounded. We walked a few steps away from the crowd toward the edge of the parking structure, where traffic noise hummed softly below us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said, "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under." I stared at the city skyline quietly before answering, "That's part of the problem." He looked down immediately. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked old. Not powerful, not intimidating, just old. Like someone finally cornered by years of choices he could no longer organize into flattering explanations. "I did what I thought was necessary," he said eventually. There it was. The sentence parents use when they want understanding without accountability. Necessary for whom? That's always the missing question. I folded my arms against the cold. "You built the company around protecting Daniel from failure." "That's not true." "It is." He opened his mouth immediately, closed it again. Because deep down, he knew. That's the difficult thing about long-term favoritism. Everyone inside the family feels it eventually. Some benefit from it, some survive it, but nobody escapes its damage completely. "I thought you were stronger," he admitted quietly. "God." That single sentence explained my entire childhood more honestly than anything he had ever said before. Not loved more responsibly, not respected more deeply. Just expected to endure more pain silently because I could. So I think a lot of families do this without realizing how cruel it becomes. They see the capable child surviving difficult treatment and mistake survival for immunity. But strong children still bleed. They just learn how to do it privately. I looked at my father carefully. "You know what strength actually is?" He didn't answer. "It's not carrying everyone forever." I swallowed slowly. "It's knowing when something is destroying you and leaving anyway." His eyes shifted then. Small change, but real. Because for the first time, he understood I was not threatening departure anymore. I had already emotionally left months ago, maybe years ago. The company wasn't losing me suddenly. It was discovering how long I'd been disappearing quietly inside it. Behind us, employees started filtering back into the building after clearance was given. The crisis was over. At least technically. But something irreversible had happened anyway. My father rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. What happens now? That question almost made me sad, because it was the first honest thing he had asked me in years. Not defensive, not controlling, not strategic, just human. And honestly, I respected him more in that broken moment than I had during most of my adult life. But respect and trust are not the same thing. I don't know, I answered truthfully. Then after a pause, I added, but it can't keep functioning like this. He nodded once slowly. Tiny movement, heavy with things arriving too late. When I finally carried my office box to my car, Daniel was standing near the entrance smoking angrily. He looked at me approaching but didn't speak immediately. Then finally, you really think leaving fixes anything? Interesting question. Because people raised inside dysfunctional systems often believe boundaries are abandonment. No, I said calmly. I think staying was helping everyone avoid reality. He stopped. You always think you're smarter than everyone. There was the old script again. Competence reframed as arrogance, boundaries reframed as cruelty. But strangely, it no longer hurt. Because once you stop needing validation from people committed to misunderstanding you, their version of you loses power. I set the box carefully into my truck, then looked back at him one last time. You know what the worst part is? He crossed his arms defensively. What? I spent years trying to earn love from people who were only comfortable receiving things from me. Silence. Real silence. Daniel looked away first. Not because he understood fully, because some truths become impossible to argue with once spoken plainly. I got into my car after that. No dramatic music, no final speech, no revenge fantasy, just exhaustion slowly turning into freedom. As I drove away from Mercer Interiors for the last time, rain began falling lightly across the windshield. Atlanta traffic crawled beneath gray evening skies while the city blurred softly around me. And somewhere between one red light and the next, my phone buzzed. A message from Mia. You okay? I smiled for the first time all day, then typed back, for the first time in years, I think I might be. Months later, I heard the company survived. Barely. Several clients left. 2 senior managers resigned. Daniel struggled badly once real accountability reached him consistently. My father eventually stepped back from daily operations after health complications connected to stress. And strangely, I didn't feel victorious hearing any of it. Because despite everything, they were still my family. And pain inside families is rarely satisfying. Mostly it's just sad. I started consulting independently after leaving. Smaller projects, healthier clients, better boundaries. The first time a client thanked me sincerely and then told me to take the weekend off instead of answering emails at midnight, I almost cried in my car afterward. Not because of the kindness itself, because I realized how abnormal my old life had been. Healing is strange like that. Sometimes it begins with experiences so ordinary they expose how badly you were treated before. About a year after I left the company, my father called me unexpectedly, not to ask for help, not to manipulate me, just to talk. He sounded quieter, softer somehow, older. He spoke for nearly an hour, mostly about ordinary things. Weather, work, my apartment. Then near the end of the call, he said something I never expected to hear. I should have protected you too. I closed my eyes immediately after he said it, because some apologies arrive so late they stop feeling triumphant. They just feel heavy. But still, it mattered. Not enough to erase everything. Nothing could, but enough to let part of the grief finally loosen its grip. Before hanging up, he said, "You were never difficult, Olivia." My throat tightened instantly. 40 years old, and somehow a single sentence from a parent could still reach the child inside me. "I know," I whispered. And this time, I actually did. If there's anything I've learned from all of this, it's that favoritism doesn't only damage relationships. It distorts identity. The overlooked child learns to confuse usefulness with worth. The favored child learns to confuse attention with love. And the parents slowly lose the ability to recognize either child clearly at all. But healing begins when someone finally interrupts the pattern. Not loudly, not perfectly, just honestly. Family should never require one person to disappear so everyone else can stay comfortable. And protecting your peace from people who only value your endurance is not selfish. Sometimes, it's the first truly loving thing you ever do for yourself.